Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm excited to talk about Mount Sinai. Before the advent of modern exploration, geographers understood that the traditional evidence pointed to the location of the Israelite enslavement in the southeastern delta, a Red Sea crossing at the northern end of the Gulf of Suez, a Mount Sinai in southern Sinai, and a Kadesh Barnea at Petra. From a historical geographical point of view, each of these more or less matches the topographic details of the Hebrew Bible, except Kadesh Barnea, where the tradition of its location was lost following the end of the Iron Age. We will not have enough time to work through these specific historical geographical arguments regarding each of these identifications. However, I did want to note at the outset that a forthcoming book, co-authored with Mark Jansen, will provide detailed analysis for every toponym mentioned in the Exodus and wilderness wanderings. My job today is not to provide a comprehensive argument in favor of a southern Sinai for biblical Mount Sinai. Rather, I have been tasked with demonstrating the methodological flaws associated with the search for Mount Sinai in general. Various modern popular theories cite the same bare threads of evidence as being unique. This evidence is not only not unique, it does not matter. The evidence that matters for locating Mount Sinai derives from the historical geographical approach, which in my estimation clearly points to southern Sinai. Across the Sinai Peninsula in Saudi Arabia, 10 or so mountains have been suggested for the biblical Mount Sinai. Broadly speaking, these suggestions can be grouped into three regional zones: northern Sinai, southern Sinai, and Saudi Arabia. Today, presentations of the identification of Mount Sinai with mountains in Saudi Arabia are by far the most easily accessible to the public. Most of these suggestions are very recent and, as we will see, do not hold up to even a very fundamental inspection of history, geography, archaeology, or logic. In terms of the history of research, southern Sinai has been the traditional location for Mount Sinai from at least as early as the 4th century CE, as indicated by the testimony of Eusebius in his Onomasticon, as well as Agiria's pilgrimage to Jebel Musa and its vicinity. Evidence from the roughly contemporary Pudinger table, which includes much earlier material, likewise provides testimony to Mount Sinai's location in southern Sinai, and you can see it right there in the center. In my view, it is also abundantly clear that Josephus understood that Mount Sinai was located in southern Sinai, which pushes the tradition for a southern Sinai location back to at least the 1st century CE. Those holding to an Arabian view often point to the Apostle Paul's statement in Galatians 4:25 that refers to Mount Sinai in Arabia as support for a northern Arabian location. Proponents of this view also often associate the Galatians passage with the textual evidence from Josephus and Eusebius, who likewise associated Mount Sinai with the term Arabia. After the 106 CE Roman conquest of the Nabatean kingdom, which was inclusive of Sinai, Nabatea was renamed Arabia Petraea. But even before that, the region was widely referred to as Arabia. Thus, the Roman-era association of Mount Sinai with Arabia is not indicative of a Saudi Arabian location. Modern research into the location of Mount Sinai, the Exodus route, and the wilderness wanderings began in the first half of the 19th century, with the explorations of John Louis Burckhardt, followed by Edward Robinson with Eli Smith. The second half of that century witnessed the pioneering works of the Sinai Ordnance Survey, led by E.H. Palmer and Charles Wilson. Despite the murder of Palmer, which cut short one of the brightest scholars of that generation, Henry Clay Trumbull and others continued to explore much of the region associated with the wilderness wanderings. The years preceding and during the First World War led to the intensive mapping and survey of the Negev highlands and northern Sinai by such military officials as Stuart Francis Newcomb and Alois Musil, the latter being a key figure in the emergence of an Arabian Sinai hypothesis. Archaeology first came to the region with the work of none other than T.E. Lawrence, who briefly excavated at Tel Kuderet, biblical Kadesh Barnea. In the intervening years between the world wars, scholars began to suggest alternative candidates in the northern Sinai, such as Jebel Halal, It is important to note that these suggestions were based on archaeological, geographical, and philological considerations related to understanding the biblical topographic details. Following the Six-Day War in 1967, academic interest in the route of the Exodus increased. After the Israeli conquest and subsequent surveying of the Sinai Peninsula, a few new candidates were suggested in the northern and central Sinai. But by and large, the only candidate to continue to be seen, back up there, to be seen as a viable candidate, there you go, is Har Karkom, or as it's known in Arabic, Jebel Abid. Har Karkom's popularity is due to the extensive writings of Emmanuel Nati, who we saw earlier. He argued that the Exodus story should be associated with the Sinai Negev settlements from the Intermediate Bronze Age, dated to about 1,000 years before the time period associated with the Exodus. Given its relative popularity, I will include Anati's criteria for Har Karkom in my analysis. Since the late 19th century, a few scholars had already suggested that Mount Sinai was actually located in the northern Arabian Peninsula. Beginning in the 1970s and continuing into the present, several scholars began suggesting an Arabian location for Sinai in connection with the volcanic Hala al-Badar. These suggestions remain very much in the minority among scholars, but they are not fundamentally rapacious towards a naive public, as seems to be the case with many, although surely not all, within the next group. Starting with the discoveries of the infamous Ron Wyatt in the 1980s, and I'd say discoveries in quotation marks, including a notorious Egyptian chariot wheel, a whole host of pseudo-archaeological and amateur explorers have claimed to have found evidence for Mount Sinai at either the sites of Jebel al-Waz or the nearby peak Jebel Makla in the northern Tabuk region of Saudi Arabia. The above-mentioned views have historical and geographical problems, but they pale in comparison with the preposterous suggestions to locate the Sea of Reeds crossing in the Gulf of Aqaba or Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. These impossible identifications are built on a variety of misconceptions and other so-called evidence that never deal with the only relevant issue, site identifications in the historical geographical approach, or rooted in the historical geographical approach. Each of the proponents for the different candidates regularly appeal to unique combinations of evidence in favor of their identification. It is suggested that only Jebel al-Waz, Har Karkom, or even Jebel Musa could fulfill each of these criteria. For example, theories claim that only Jebel Makla could possibly have a cleft, an altar, rock art, a cave, burnt-looking summit, large open space, a spring, and modern testimonial evidence. Yet, as can be seen on this chart, each of the other candidates is capable of uniquely fulfilling this type of evidence. This type of criteria offers a false sense of proof that can be easily applied to dozens, if not more than that, mountains throughout the southern deserts. As an aside, it should be noted that the region of Midian in northern Saudi Arabia is not unknown when it comes to biblical geography. A number of the descendants of Abraham and Keturah have been localized using the principles of historical geography in the very region where amateur explorers claim to have found Mount Sinai. The Arabic names preserve the biblical tribal names as given in Genesis 25. And as an aside to the aside, I would say based on Erez Ben Yosef's excellent paper we heard this morning, we can do much the same for Genesis 36 using the material we have from a loose morsel. So to the spurious criteria, we start with a cleft in the rock. Proponents of Jebel al-Waz, Hala al-Badar, Har Karkom, and Jebel Musa unfailingly point to a cleft in the rock near the summit of the given mountain in connection with God's appearance to Moses. Yet, almost all mountains have clefts that could possibly qualify for this type of evidence. Indeed, a chapel was constructed atop such a cleft at Jebel Musa in 560 CE. Spurious criteria number 2, an altar with 12 standing stones near the base of the mountain. Regardless of the date and its identification, the structure near Jebel Makla that is often identified as the altar of Moses is certainly nothing like altars found in Canaan or Egypt. What is regularly described as an altar or an altar complex is a large structure that seems to date to the Nabatean period, as indicated by the ceramics found at the site. The so-called 12 standing stones are fragments of pillars that were quarried at Jebel al-Makla. which only could have occurred during the Nabatean period based on the style of the column drums, as well as their connection with the Nabatean encampment at the base of the mountain. While such scholars as Glenn Fritz admit the Nabatean dating of the columns, he concocts a bizarre theory that the columns were used only for the purpose that they might be explained by the historical presence of a prosperous Jewish population in Arabia that associated this part of the Jebel al-Lawaz range with Mount Sinai and decided to construct a memorial synagogue at the supposed site. The building excavated by Ansari bears no resemblance to contemporary synagogues, and I might add, there is zero evidence of any Jewish presence at Jebel Makla at any period of time. Humphrey's argument, so this would be at Hala al-Badar, and you can see the title up there on the top because it's going to get a bit repetitive, is based on Musil's report that the Beli local tribesmen sacrificed at a place where there are 12 stones in 1910. There is clearly Islamic traditional evidence that places Moses in northern Saudi Arabia when he visited Jethro, but this traditional evidence does not claim any association between North Arabia and Mount Sinai. Moreover, it is ironic that Humphreys rejects the earlier 4th century tradition that we cited before in favor of evidence from only a century ago. Despite the numerous problems with Anati's suggestions, there is no doubt that Har Harkom was an important site during the 3rd millennium BCE, and that there are abundant cultic remains at the site. However, this set of standing stones, which one of the things he points to, seems to not have an altar and dates to the mid to late 3rd millennium BCE, well before any suggested date for the emergence of Israel. To my knowledge, there is no specific location of an altar or tradition of one. However, there is a traditional altar at the cave of Elijah, as relayed by Agiria at Jebel Musa. Spurious criteria number 3, a golden calf altar site. The pile of rocks at the base of Jebel Makla that is often identified with the golden calf altar site is a pile of rocks with no structural evidence. Humphrey's argument to connect the golden calf episode with the moon god Sin, who was often depicted as a bull, has little evidence in its favor. The traditional site of Aaron's Hill on the eastern edge of Raha has been connected with the golden calf episode since the 4th century. You can read about it in Agiria. Spurious criteria number 4, rock art and or inscriptions. Regarding the depictions of cattle and petroglyphs at Jebel Makla, we must note that rock art is notoriously difficult to date, and there remain major problems and disagreements among the leading researchers. Nevertheless, it is certain that the bovine petroglyphs from the vicinity of Makla are not contemporary with New Kingdom Egypt. It seems plausible that they were made in 2 main periods, during the Neolithic through the early Bronze Age and the Nabatean period. The vast majority of rock art in Arabia dates from the earlier period, when the climate of Saudi Arabia changed rapidly from cool and humid in the Neolithic to extremely hot and arid in the Bronze Age. Cattle gradually disappeared and were replaced by camels. Therefore, the bovine petroglyphs at Jebel Makla are simply either way too early or far too late to be related to the Exodus. The ubiquitous claim among Jebel Makla's proponents to associate bovine petroglyphs with the golden calf episode through an assumed connection with New Kingdom depictions of either the Apis bull or Hathor demonstrates ignorance of the vast chronological, spatial, and stylistic differences between New Kingdom Egyptian and Neolithic or even Nabatean artistic styles. The 2 most cited examples of inscriptional evidence are the so-called Yahweh stone and the menorah petroglyph, both of which originate with Song Hak Kem. Neither have anything to do with the Exodus, Mount Sinai, the biblical period, or, if you can believe it, the vicinity of Jebel Makla. The menorah petroglyph, which does bear some resemblance to a menorah, was found by Kim in Wadi Atna, which is 130 kilometers away from Jebel Makla. However, MacDonald has pointed out that the menorah is actually 2 Hismaic letters that are part of a common native Arabian prayer to the goddess Lat. Thus, not only is this clearly not a menorah, but it dates to between the 1st century BCE through the 4th century CE. Regarding the so-called Yahweh stone, it is almost certainly a modern forgery. Even if it were demonstrated to be authentic, the stone has no provenance, as it was apparently gifted to Kim by the former governor of Mecca, and thus cannot be related to a particular region or culture within Arabia. Returning to Har Harkom, Anati offers various suggestions, some of which we saw earlier, connecting rock engravings near Harcombe with events associated with the Exodus and Mount Sinai. For example, he, in my opinion, unconvincingly connects examples of rock art at Harcombe with depictions of serpents or even the tablets of the Ten Commandments. There is not significant rock art or inscriptions in the immediate vicinity of Jebel Musa. However, both modern scholarship and ancient tradition, again, Agiria, have used Nabatean rock inscriptions from Wadi Mukatib, the Wadi of Inscriptions, in support of a southern Sinai location. Spurious evidence number 5, the cave of Elijah on the side of the mountain. Invariably, proponents of Jebel Makla, Hala al-Badar, Har Karkom, and Jebel Musa point to a cave on the side of their favored mountain. Like the cleft of the rock above, it should go without saying that it is quite common for mountains to have caves along their slopes. Accordingly, their existence should play no role in identifying Mount Sinai. Spurious evidence number 6, burned or blackened rock or ashes near the summit. Despite the ever-present claims that the darkened tops of either Jebel Waz or Makla were burned by the fire of God, the dark color of the stone in these mountains is clearly related to geology and not divine fire. Foundational to Humphrey's proposal, and I didn't record it actually exploding, this is another volcanic eruption, is that Mount Sinai was an active volcano during the Exodus. His identification with Hala al-Badar was due to the fact that he believes it was the only active volcano in the vicinity that was within 11 days' march to Kadesh Barnea, as we read in Deuteronomy 1:1. Anati suggests there are traces of fire on Har Karkom and its vicinity. Several explorers in the 17th and 18th century argued that Jebel Musa's gray color was due to it being blackened with smoke. Spurious evidence number 7, a large open space at the foot of the mountain. Proponents of Jebel Makla, Hala al-Badar, Har Karkom, and Jebel Musa always suggest a connection with a nearby plain or valley. The fact that each of these mountains have a wide valley in their vicinity demonstrates that this cannot be used as an indication of the right location of Mount Sinai. Although this might be a useful category for deciding between Jebel Sirbal, Jebel Musa, and Ras of Safa. Despite being the second highest mountain in the Sinai Peninsula, Jebel Sirbal is largely inaccessible and has no wide plain in its immediate vicinity. Ras of Safa, which is another peak on the same mountain range as Jebel Musa, offers great views, and this is from the top of Jebel Musa. It offers great views of the traditional location of the Israelite encampment. Spurious evidence number 8, a spring or split rock. The so-called split rock of Moses, a large rock formation with a 20-inch vertical gap, is the most cited piece of evidence in favor of Jebel Makla. However, the so-called split rock is 120 kilometers away from either Jebel al-Waz or Jebel Makla. It is also clearly a naturally occurring rock formation. Humphreys argues that the nearby sandstone mountain of Tadra held large quantities of rainwater that would have provided the water resources needed for the Israelites. Anati points to the springs in the vicinity of Har Karkom, which he connects with the biblical site of Rephidim. The area around Jebel Musa is one of the most well-watered regions of Sinai. Tradition has associated biblical events with specific nearby springs or rocky outcroppings, such as Hajar Musa. Last one. Spurious evidence number 9, testimonial evidence. Several proponents of Jebel Makla cite that Makla or Lwaz are referred to as Jebel Musa. However, the fact that this evidence comes from the early 21st century has zero significance, as amateur explorers have been traveling to the region and calling the mountains Mount Sinai since the 1980s. Likewise, the claim that Jebel al-Waz, the mountains of almonds, may be related to the use of stylized almond blossoms in the menorah or Aaron's rod is patently absurd. The fact that almonds grow on the mountain is the obvious etymological background of the Arabic name. Humphreys cites Musa's report from a century ago that the Belly refused to approach Hala al-Badar ostensibly because of the memory of a volcanic eruption. Humphrey speculates that this avoidance could go back to the time of Moses in connection with Exodus 19. In my estimation, one of the greatest difficulties with Anati's proposal is that he assumes that the tradition of the events of the Exodus were remembered for 1,000 years, while giving no real evidence to explain how such a tradition would have been remembered. The core of his argument is archaeology, but there is no reason to associate any of the remains with the Exodus or the Israelites or even the Canaanites for that matter, as we have little historical knowledge of the Intermediate Bronze Age. Clearly, Jebel Musa and its vicinity have at least a 2,000-year-old tradition as being the setting for Israel's experience as described in Exodus. Burkhardt, Robinson, Palmer, and others reconstructed Agiria's visit to Jebel Musa in 390 CE, which is the earliest pilgrim account. As we have seen, Jebel Musa, like all of the other more recently suggested Sinais, possesses the same type of evidence, physical features in and around a particular mountain that is the desired chosen mountain for a given view. This type of evidence doesn't matter for determining the location of Mount Sinai. The identification of Mount Sinai can only be established through the disciplines of historical geography, which involves much more than simply identifying the mountain itself and then working backwards. We need to approach the question with the tried and true method of historical geography. Historical geography is a synthesis of four disciplines: physical geography, philology, which is the study of ancient languages and texts, toponymy, the study of place names, and archaeology, the study of human material remains. For the last 2 centuries, explorers and scholars have been successfully searching for biblical place names using this method, including the localities associated with the Exodus and wilderness wanderings. In our view, and here I'm including my colleague Mark Jansen, there are 4 fixed points and 2 firm points for establishing the route of the Exodus and wilderness wanderings from the Delta to Kadesh Barnea. The fixed points include the following. Fixed point number 1, the land of Goshen and Ramses localized in the eastern Delta. Fixed point number 2, the Sea of Reeds identified with one of the inland lakes along the eastern Egyptian frontier. Firm point number 1, so not quite fixed, but firm, the Pharaon oasis as a campsite between the Sea of Reeds and Mount Sinai. Fixed point number 3, Mount Sinai, located in southern Sinai. Firm point number 2, Ein Hudzra, which preserves the name Hatzerot, between Mount Sinai and Kadesh Barnea. Fixed point number 4, Ein El Kuderet, as the location of biblical Kadesh Barnea. In addition, we can point to 3 key historical geographical points of evidence for connecting Mount Sinai with the southern Sinai Peninsula. First, physical geography. The fixed points of the Sea of Reeds and Kadesh Barnea demand Sinai's location within the Sinai Peninsula. Second, the related firm points, Pharaon and Hatzerot, are strongly suggestive of a southern versus northern location. In our estimation, it seems like no coincidence that the 3 most well-watered regions of southern Sinai, Pharaon, Hudra, and the vicinity of Jebel Musa, should be associated with significant locales on the Exodus journey. Third, there are several extra-biblical texts that can be understood as referring to Yahweh in southern Sinai. These include the following: Julian Cooper's recent argument that demonstrates the name Sinai was already in use in the Middle Kingdom, and reference to southern Sinai, and he makes a compelling case to connect it with the region of Serebit al-Hadam in this vicinity. The name Yah, in connection with the Sinai Peninsula on New Kingdom name rings at Soleb and Amara West, and the early 8th century BCE inscription, Yahweh of Teman, or I would say the south, from Quintilit Ajrud. All told, there remain compelling historical geographical reasons for continuing to identify biblical Mount Sinai with southern Sinai. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Anybody?
Thanks. Well, I would just like to connect this back to Phil's paper before, because if you take a literary analysis of the text seriously, then the different toponyms come from different sources in different times. How would this allow you to put them all together to reconstruct a route to the southern Sinai, if they might come from different perceptions, imaginations?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And so what I'd say is I'm coming at it from Rainey and Notley were mentioned earlier from Sacred Bridge. I'm coming at it from the perspective of I think the geography is largely the foundation. It stays the same. So even if we have different perspectives or even different names of places that largely comport to the same region, I am much more open, despite an excellent paper, I am much more open to harmonizing those possibilities wherever they are possible to do so. And I think in our book version, we do just that. We demonstrate how some of these, the classic one is Horeb and Sinai and so on, how they can harmonize with one another. But that's exactly the area that is within the book that I would love to talk to Philip about, to make sure that not only we're covering all of our bases, but trying to think through that very carefully in terms of source critical analysis. Great question.
Great. Time for another. Carl?
Some of the aspects of the theophany described around Mount Sinai sound to me like a volcano. There's smoke and sounds. How do you account for those in southern Sinai?
Yes, but they don't necessarily have to be. I think, again, in terms of the fact that the historical geography excludes the fact of any potential volcano, which is the closest one, is Saudi Arabia. I don't go and say, I like the volcano idea, so I'm going to make sure that all the geography goes out the window so that I can prove that. I start with the text. I then move to, it's a description of the landscape. I follow the rules set forth by Edward Robinson of blessed memory, and that precludes the fact that even if there's smoke and lightning and these types of things, it could be volcano. There is no volcano in the vicinity of where the biblical text, which again is the main source for all of this, says that Mount Sinai should be located. So I think it's a coincidence.